Ven Señor Jesús, Maranatha. Ven Señor Jesús, Maranatha. Ven Señor Jesús, Maranatha. Si ven pronto, Maranatha.
I hope someone's still listening, actually, because this is really neat. This is really interesting. This is something, I mean, what I just said, everybody knows. Everyone who follows, the Middle East knows. But this, very few people know, which is the brilliance of Trump's plan. The brilliance of Trump's plan, yeah, even though it's totally going to fail, the brilliance of it is the following. Hamas is not Hamas, an independent agency. Hezbollah was not an independent, terrorist group. Hamas was a military arm extension of Iran to do Iran's dirty work and being funded by Iran and taking orders from Iran and totally basically being in Iran's military hierarchy, so to speak. Hamas is Qatar's irregular army. Hamas is sponsored by Qatar, Qatar. What's that mean? It means that, I'll just read this paragraph. This is about state-sponsored terrorist groups. Terror organizations seek state sponsorship. State sponsorship of violent, armed, non-state actors has occurred for decades. Notable partnerships include Iran and Hezbollah, Iraq and the Kurdish Workers' Party, the PKK, which is a terrorist group, Syria and Qatar with Hamas. Syria is no longer there because Syria fell to ISIS, actually. Saudi Arabia and Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda was basically sponsored by Saudi Arabia. Hamas is sponsored by Qatar. The PKK is sponsored by Iraq. Hezbollah is sponsored by Iran. See, this is actually a brilliant strategy for these bad actors, for these wicked countries, because, if Iran attacks Israel, Israel can nuke Iran, right? But if a independent terrorist group attacks Israel, there's no target there. There's no retaliation possible. The same thing with Hamas and Qatar. That, Qatar can do anything it wants through Hamas, and Israel can't retaliate against Qatar, except it did, right? About 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. And that's where this peace plan, that fits into this peace plan. This is part of the brilliant deal making of Trump. Continuing, and the material assistance that these terrorist groups get include financial, arms, military training, logistical support, and safe haven for members. I think you know that the high management of Hamas, the upper echelon of Hamas, lives entirely in Doha, which is the capital of Qatar, in a five-star hotel, gorging themselves on caviar every night. I think they're worth something like $10 billion between the five of them, living it up in Doha, because the terror organizations get safe haven in their state sponsors, which is what Qatar is. Qatar is the state sponsor of Hamas. Terror organizations can increase their legitimacy in the eyes of local and regional actors by having the state sponsorship. They carry out violent acts on the state's behalf and help their patrons' interests domestically and abroad. Okay. Qatar is Hamas's by far most important financial backer and foreign ally. Qatari Emir Sheikh Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani was the first state leader to visit the Hamas government in Gaza. So far, the emirate that's Qatar, has transferred $1.8 billion to Hamas. I don't know when this was written. Hamas's 1988 charter I read, Hamas is an Islamist militant group that spun off from the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood in the late 80s, and it took over the Gaza Strip after defeating its rival political party, Fatah, in 2006. This is so Palestinian. I'll tell the story. Um, there was an election in 2006 for at the moment, Hamas and Fatah were united as the two branches of Palestinian leadership, and they agreed to have an election to see which one, whether Hamas would control the Palestinian Authority or Fatah slash the PLO would control the Palestinian Authority. PLO of Yasser Arafat's fame, because this was not that long after Arafat died. Okay, so they had an election. The election was pretty evenly split. So this was the election. But okay, so this was the January 2006 Palestinian legislative election. This just shows the representatives, because it was a representative election, just like the U.S. So it was divided into these territories, and the popular vote was very evenly split, but Hamas still won. Hamas won 44.5% of the vote, and Fatah won 41.5% of the vote. So Hamas won the popular election, by about a 10% spread. But it won the representatives by a much bigger spread, 74 to 45, okay? So the plan was that the winning party would run the government. However, Fatah wasn't going to step down. So they started a war, basically. In the war in Gaza, Hamas won the war and basically killed all the Fatah soldiers or terrorists or whatever you want to call them, the Fatah members, and then spent the next year or two or three after the war cleaning up by just executing all the ones they found. So anyway, these are the two parties that somehow, will kiss and make up, and Hamas will happily coexist, laying down their weapons, and the Palestinian, who knows? I mean, this Palestinian, what does he even call it? It's so ridiculous. The Palestinian Unicord Brigade. The Palestinian Authority will complete its reform program as outlined in various proposals. The committee will be made up of qualified Palestinians. Like these are, anyway, I mean, there at the time, the major war was between Fatah and Hamas. There were times when it was a three-way war with Fatah and Hamas and Hezbollah. These are the people who are all going to kiss and make up now magically, because they're going to, start having a unicorn rodeo and compete there instead. I mean, anyway. Okay, the brilliance. So here's the brilliance. Qatar is the state sponsor of Hamas. Trump is a really brilliant deal maker, okay? So nobody has any leverage over Hamas because the charter says their greatest glory is to die for Allah, right? They're dedicated to killing Jews wherever they find them. So, if they're, and they don't, not only that, the more Gazans who die, the better for Hamas. That was clear, right? Why did Israel have to bomb all those buildings? Why couldn't they just, purge the areas where Hamas headquarters were and go through those buildings and make sure they were empty? Tell everyone to leave and go through those buildings and make sure there was no Hamas infrastructure left, no Hamas offices, no Hamas weapons facilities, no Hamas, headquarters. Why couldn't they? Because Hamas booby-trapped all the buildings. I don't know if you remember the early days of the Gaza war, but all of many of the Israeli soldiers who got killed, they booby-trapped every building. They booby-trapped every tunnel. So Israel got tired of losing soldiers because they couldn't enter a building without getting blown up. The only way to evacuate Hamas from a building was to blow it up. And whenever Israel did, they did what they called knocking on the roof. They would drop leaflets, and they would drop, I don't know what they dropped, like little things onto the roof that made a lot of noise. They called that knocking on the roof. And that was the warning that the next thing that would happen would be a bomb. They didn't bomb buildings before knocking on the roof so that people could leave. But where was I? So anyway, there's no leverage over Hamas by definition, in a sense, since, they claim they want to die. They don't have any geographic area to be threatened, and they supposedly don't care about their own lives. They certainly don't care about their foot soldiers' lives. I mean, perhaps the upper echelon, these obese billionaires, care about their lives, but they're safely in Qatar. They don't care about the lives of anyone in Gaza, that's for sure. So how do you get leverage over them? You can't. But the United States has a lot of leverage over Qatar. Why does the United States have a lot of leverage over Qatar? Well, until recently, Qatar almost had more leverage over the United States because the United States' largest military base in the Middle East, Air Force Base, is in Qatar. And Qatar could throw them out from one day to the next, and the United States wouldn't have a military base in the Middle East. So Qatar actually had a little leverage over the United States. Qatar was very happy that the United States was there because it provided their defense. So the United States had a little bit of leverage over Qatar. But Israel, when Israel bombed in Doha, in the capital of Qatar, bombed that place where the Hamas upper leadership was having a meeting, and they just, with impunity, flew in with jets, dropped bombs, blew up the building, flew off without a scratch. When Israel made it clear that they were willing to bomb Qatar, because of course Qatar was the sponsor of Hamas and was where Hamas leadership was, all of a sudden Qatar realized it had no pants on, excuse the expression. It was completely naked. Israel could do whatever it wanted, and Israel had already given the warning shot to Qatar that we're holding you responsible for Hamas. We know you're running Hamas. We know you're protecting Hamas. We know you're funding Hamas. We're holding you responsible. It's no longer gloves off. So it totally changed the balance in the Middle East. The point was made. The point of that bombing run wasn't to kill Hamas leadership. It was to give Qatar a wake-up call. Okay, so Qatar is now trembling in spoots, right? So what does Qatar do? It goes running to the United States essentially for protection. And what does the United States say to Qatar? What does Trump say to Qatar? He says, you have to get Hamas to release all of the hostages. You want US to protect you. You get Hamas to release the hostages. The art of the deal is to find leverage over you could say, over everyone involved in the deal. Find what will motivate them for it to be in their own interest to sign up for the deal. And everybody has a different set of things they want to avoid. So you find a mix, a combination of jigsaw puzzle pieces that fit together, give everybody what they want, more or less, okay? So United States signed a mutual defense treaty with Qatar, okay? If anyone attacks Qatar, United States will consider it an attack on the United States and will retaliate. So Qatar got 100% protection from Israel, which is what it wanted. In return, Qatar promised to get all of the hostages released. Hamas is totally dependent on Qatar. United States had no possible leverage on Hamas. Once Israel bombed Qatar, United States had huge leverage on Qatar. Qatar has infinite leverage on Hamas. Therefore, Trump could get Hamas to agree to this deal. Hamas didn't agree to this deal, if you've been following the news. They didn't agree to this deal. They turned it down flat. And then they were summoned to a meeting with Qatar. And they left that meeting with Qatar saying, okay, we agree. So anyway, that is one side of the equation. Now, what about the other side of the equation? Now, supposedly, look, this is Major League Baseball, okay? So it's not like the posture that these players present, when they're interviewed on Sunday morning news interview shows. It's not like they're placing their cards on the table face up. Everything is part of the strategy. So anyway, so Israel bombs Qatar, and Trump gets very indignant and says to Israel, "Oh, you better not do that again. You got me really mad, really mad." And he calls Netanyahu on the carpet to chew him out. "How dare you do this without getting my permission first?" Okay, this is all part of the act. It's like a good cop, bad cop routine. So, so the public presentation that the world was supposed to see was that Israel did this on their own, and it started a enmity between Trump and Netanyahu. And then Trump turns around and twists Netanyahu's arm and gets him to reluctantly agree to this peace proposal. Okay, they're no longer friends. I don't know if you saw the humiliating picture. Netanyahu went to the White House for a meeting with Trump, and Trump held the phone on his lap and made Netanyahu call the Emir of Qatar and apologize for the bombing. Okay, this was supposed to be a public humiliation of Netanyahu to show that they hated each other now. This is all part of the script. Okay, so what's Netanyahu's part in this deal is that Netanyahu's most important criterion was to get the hostages released. Okay, for two reasons. One is the humanitarian reason. I think it's silly, actually. I think they would have been much better saying on October 8th, "We're very sorry. Those 250 people died effectively in war, and we're going to conduct this war and saving the long-term survival of Israel. And it's a shame, but those 250 people are lost." But Israel didn't do that. Those 250 people became the most important thing in Israeli politics for the last 2 years. So what's Netanyahu get out of this? He gets out of it the return of the surviving hostages, which is about 20, which is wonderful, and he cares about that. But what he also gets is that the opposition, the political opposition to Netanyahu for the last 2 years was, "Where are the hostages? You failed miserably. You haven't gotten the hostages back." He got back a lot of them. But all the demonstrations in the street, "We want our hostages back. Give Hamas whatever they want. Withdraw from Gaza. We want the hostages released." Now, of course, the hostages wouldn't have been released if Israel just withdrew from Gaza. It's really stupid. The only reason the hostages are being released is because Hamas is on the mat, has basically lost it was always going to lose the fight, but has lost the fight and is in desperate straits, which is the only way you would get them released. But anyway, it was like Black Lives Matter in the United States. It was this big fake grassroots movement. Anything for the hostages. Netanyahu is evil. He doesn't care about the hostages. Netanyahu only cares about his political survival. He doesn't care about the hostages. That's that heat off him. In other words, Netanyahu, the opposition just evaporates because the hostages come home. Now, so let's say the hostages do come home in the next week. The living hostages. Hamas has already reneged on the deal about the deceased hostages. Anyway, the living hostages come home. Hamas doesn't release the dead ones. Hamas doesn't disarm. Hamas doesn't do any of the other conditions. Hamas continues attacking Israel. Whatever Hamas continues doing, who knows what Hamas does? But I think Israel knows and Trump knows that there's no chance in what, that Hamas will continue to abide by these conditions. And so sooner or later, the deal will fall apart. Israel will resume the war, but with no living hostages left as a leverage that Hamas has, and with the United States' blessing, because Israel had agreed to the U.S. Trump's peace plan, and Hamas had violated Trump's peace plan, so the gloves are off, so to speak. So it was absolutely brilliant diplomacy by Netanyahu and Trump in cahoots, because this was thought out long before the bombing run on Doha. Trump and Netanyahu had worked out this brilliant deal-making strategy. Okay? So the peace plan is a farce. Look at the timing of this. The signing of this peace deal was what? It was like 3 days before the Nobel Peace Prize was going to be awarded. How could they not award it to Trump? They didn't, of course, because, they hate him more than, well, they're just, what I mean, they're completely cabal central. So anyway, they didn't. But that's a coincidence that this whole thing was choreographed to come to a climax the week before the Nobel Peace Prize committee, announces the winner. Anyway, this was worked out months ago, I think, and it was successful. It was successful. It got the hostages back, and that is the one thing that really mattered to Israel, because it can continue the war in a week or 2 weeks or in a month or in 6 weeks or however long it takes for the farce of Hamas's agreement to become visible. Let's see what we're doing. Okay, sounds like a wave. I know what that was. That was when I played that. Attached link. I don't know what link. I'll see if you say. Hamas said it would release the hostages tomorrow. It'll probably release the hostages in the next week or so. I think because of Qatar. Because of Qatar. I'm not going to, I love all of you. I'm happy all of you are there listening and participating in the chat. But this is not the same old story of these young men just wanting to belong at any cost, gang mentality. This is Islam. This is their value system that they're trained up in from when they're 2 years old, 3 years old, can't watch Sesame Street in the Palestinian territories without being indoctrinated in this stuff. You can't go to school. Every school book is full of this. I mean, really. Math books are about killing Jews. Social studies are about killing Jews. Grammar lessons are about killing Jews. It's much more than gang mentality. You know why Hamas won that election? The reason Hamas won that election is because they didn't back down from our purposes to kill the Jews and take over Israel. The PLO backed down from that as a public statement because of the Oslo Accords and the Camp David Accords. They still had that as their intention, but in their public posture, they seemed more peaceful than Hamas. Hamas always made no bones about it. We're here to kill the Jews. PLO pretended we're here to get a two-state solution. Okay?
Ven Señor Jesús, Maranatha. Ven Señor Jesús, Maranatha. Ven Señor Jesús, Maranatha. Si ven pronto, Maranatha.